The devastating repercussions of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine are being felt all across Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. It's been a whole year since Russian troops first stepped foot in Ukraine. The war doesn't seem like it will ever end. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Baltic states are treating very serious. In the event that the war extends beyond Ukraine, there will be precautions taken on the western borders of Russia and Belarus, as well as in the Baltic Sea. The primary objective from a geopolitical and strategic point of view appears to be to deter Russian aggression and bring the threats posed by Russia in the Baltic Sea under control. When viewed in this light, nature not only offers Ukraine significant military assistance, but also helps to reinforce the defensive line in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Without a doubt, the strength of Ukraine's resistance and its ability to preserve its independence in the face of Russia is growing thanks to the support of Western. While the Ukrainian army is crushing the Russian forces, the United States and NATO are continuing to deal blow after blow to Russia in other regions where Russia's hand reaches. Examples include the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and NATO. The Baltic Sea provides the clearest illustration of this phenomenon that we can. Since a sizable contingent of the NATO Navy was sent to the Baltic Sea a few months ago, the presence of Russian forces in that region has significantly decreased. As a result, Estonia and other NATO members with coastlines along the Baltic Sea have successfully taken control of the necessary border, as well as maritime precautions taken before the outbreak of war in. However, NATO did not leave anything up to chance, and instead sent troops and weapons to all of its member states that border or are in close proximity to Russia. These past few days have provided us with the clearest illustration possible of one of these measures. Strategic bombers from the United States Air Force came close to Russia's borders. Following their participation in the exercises, a group of strategic bombers from the United States Air Force flew over Europe and then approached the Russian borders from a distance of just 140 kilometers away. During this approach, the bombers flew low over the capital of Estonia. You can see the moment that U.S. Air Force strategic bombers flew over Estonia territory by looking at the frames from the video that have been. The planes were only seen a few hundred meters above Telon, but the appearance of U.S. Air Force bombers on EST territory on Estonia Independence Day demonstrates that the United States has not abandoned NATO member states. The planes were seen only a few hundred meters above Telon. The appearance of strategic bombers in close proximity to the border with is undeniable evidence that NATO borders are protected against an assault by Russia and that security is maintained in the region. The United States contributed 4 B-52 strategic bombers to European airspace. Planes that were previously assigned to the minor space in North Dakota have been transferred to the Morin Basin in Spain. Prior to that, on February 24th, events commemorating Estonia's Day of Independence were held, and 2 bombers took part in those events. Late in 1945, the aftermath of World War II was still producing clouds of dust. The United States Air Force has put in a request for a brand new strategic. After this, there were many iterations of the design, which reflected the rapidly growing expectations of range and speed at the beginning of the jet age. But in the end, Boeing was able to create the B-52 Stratofortress, which is the most reliable military aircraft in history. The United States Air Force is currently preparing for a new round of upgrades to be performed on its fleet of B-52HS aircraft, the most recent of which were delivered during the Cuban Missile Crisis. First appeared in October 1962 with the intention of keeping him bushy into the 2000s and the 50s. The short answer to the question of whether or not the B-52 is still relevant in this day and age of long-range missiles, hypersonic speeds, and stealth technology is yes. When it comes to both its range and its payload, the B-52 is a top-tier aircraft that has also shown itself to be extremely versatile over the course of its. When it comes to the most important aspects of the fight, the B-52 is reliable. The plane is prepared to bomb a target whenever it receives the order to do so. It is impossible for stealth jets to boast such dependability, and in any case, entire privacy technologies are steadily rendering the stealth signature capabilities. Able, the large and cumbersome B-52 will outlive much more enticing platforms such as the speedy Boeing B-1 and D Stealthy and the Northrop Grumman B-2, both of which will be replaced by the Northrop B-21 radar. It remains to be seen whether the platform, which is expected to be completed around the year 2020, will be more durable than B-52. The B-2 has been in service for 20 years and has an exterior profile that is comparable to that of the B-20. If the B-21 is successful in reaching this goal, the B-52 will be getting close to its centennial year while still operating according to the original flight plans. For From observation missions to subsequent bombing to delivery of increasingly devastating payloads, the story of the innocence of the B-52 traces of path from the early days of military aviation to Armageddon. This path follows weapons through the use of the very first nuclear bombers such as the B-17s, B-24 seconds, and B-29 seconds, all the way up to the B-52 seconds, which are still in use today. It is also capable of carrying tactical nuclear weapons, which offer the assurance of mutually assured destruction for the entire group. In addition to the B-52 tubes, what other countermeasures are currently being implemented in the? It is believed that Washington still maintains a poverty expert military pressure on the Baltic region, which is located in an area where there has been an increase in the potential for security risks in the medium and long term for the Baltic states. As a direct response to Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and invasion of Ukraine in 2015, several countries, including members of NATO and the European Union, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Letonia, have significantly increased their spending on defense. Due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2023, a military assault on Estonia at that time seems unlikely. However, Russia's imperialist approach and long-term foreign policy ambitions have significantly increased security risks, especially for Estonia. The view of the Baltic states from Russia was the most vulnerable component of NATO, which made them the primary target of military pressure in the event that NATO came under. Russia conflict experts say that Russia's military presence near the borders of the Baltic states could be rebuilt within 4 years, and Russia's plan to hold large-scale military exercises on its western borders 2 years ahead of schedule could further strain the security situation in the Baltic region this year. Russia conflict experts say that Russia's military presence near the borders of the Baltic states could be rebuilt within 4. The advancement of significant military drills at a time when Russia is occupying Ukraine can be interpreted as a form of deterrence. And then there was the inciting of patriotism among the Russian people along with threats to the Western world. In light of this, what role will NATO play, particularly in the Baltic and Nordic regions if the conflict in Ukraine is allowed to? Sweden and Finland, both traditionally considered to be neutral countries, have unexpectedly applied to become members of NATO. Despite the fact that Turkey was opposed to these two countries becoming members, they were accepted anyway in the beginning for reasons having to do with politics. The membership process of Sweden and Finland continues, and both countries are currently considered to be members of the NATO. The process of Sweden and Finland joining NATO has naturally increased the organization's effectiveness in the Baltic Sea. As a result of Sweden and Finland's membership in NATO, the Baltic Sea, and Grad and St. Petersburg will all be surrounded by NATO member states, with the exception of 2 areas around it. If Norway had been a potential link between Russia and the West, then Russia's recently redeclared goal of establishing naval power in 2022, which coincides with the publication of Russia's new naval doctrine, will no longer be possible in this strategically significant region. Used strategically as important reference points for the Soviet Union during the duration of the Cold War for Russia, it would now be the territory of the Baltic state, starting from the Gulf of Finland and continuing through the Suki Corridor. This includes the island of Gotland, which is located in Swedish territory, as well as Bornholm, which is located in Danish T. Control of this region will now be a military priority for all parties in the conflict, as it is impossible to ignore the fact that vital naval lines of communication run through the area in question. The most recent event that brought this to the attention of the general public was when 3 Russian landing craft were present after making their initial foray into the Baltic Sea at the beginning of January 2022. Ships from the Northern Fleet refueled in and they sailed along with 3 other landing craft that were part of the Baltic Sea Fleet in the region of the sea that is between Kolan and Grad and Gatland, after they had been refueled and outfitted. In the days that followed, Sweden was in such a state of panic that just a few days later, it began to increase its military presence on the island, a presence that it has continued to expand and consolidate to this day when Sweden and Finland are involved. Join NATO. It will be much simpler for the forces of the alliance to keep an eye on and exercise control over vital sea lines in the Baltic Sea. From a strategic point of view, the Baltic states, along with Bornholm and Gatland in the central Baltic Sea, are becoming increasingly important for Russia's access to the Kolan and GRE enclave. This is especially the case in light of recent. Gotland will make it easier for NATO to gain potential control over the Baltic Sea region, while Kaliningrad will become a burden for Russia, a nation whose fleet does not have unrestricted access to its bases. Gotland will make this possible. In addition, power cannot be enabled for sea lines. Russia has the legal right to use vital maritime communication lines in the territory of the Baltic Sea 2S, as stated in the Maritime Convention Act of the International Maritime Organization, which is a subsidiary of the United Nations. Prior to the beginning of the war, the amount of maritime cargo that passed through St. Petersburg each day exceeded 300 million. Russia has been conducting drills over the past few months to practice moving smaller warships that are armed with comparable weapons as the Baltic region becomes increasingly constrained as a result of NATO enlargement. These exercises also serve the purpose of protecting Moscow's own freedom of action. In a similar fashion, Moscow, and Grad and St. Petersburg had built advanced defense and area denial capabilities with modern weapons systems in and around. The participation of Sweden and Finland in NATO will allow the alliance to expand its capabilities with better reconnaissance assets and defensive and even offensive weapons systems. Restricting Russia's presence in the Baltic Sea will be a major step in the right direction. Russia takes a hit not only on the military front, but also on the economic front. If Turkey does not permit Russian ships to pass through the straits, and if the Baltic Sea is closed to Russian passages, then Russia's ship traffic will begin to be made over the Arctic Sea, which is frozen for 10 months of the year. This will significantly increase the amount of time it takes for Russia's ships to. Putin does not yet realize the magnitude of the catastrophe he has brought upon his nation and its people by unjustifiably starting a war against Ukraine. However, if and when he does become aware of this in the future, he may be removed from his position as president. So tell me, what are your thoughts on the matter overall? I would appreciate it if you could share your thoughts in the comment. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and that you have notifications turned on so that you are notified when we upload new videos. We appreciate you keeping an eye on us. You can help us out by becoming a subscriber. We are living through a time in which the scales of global justice are being redrawn. There is an effort being made to recreate each and every dynamic. Russia is actively working to undermine the hegemony and monopoly that NATO holds in. However, when the war in Ukraine was in its first year, we saw that Putin may have strayed from his goal. This is something that we saw when the war was in its first year. Putin's goal of reunifying Eastern Europe under a single coalition has also been hampered to a degree that has never been seen before in the annals of history. Together, we will continue to observe the destruction of Putin's Soviet. You are aware that the conflict that broke out as a result of Russia's attack on Ukraine was not confined to just these two countries, nor was it restricted to the conflict that existed between Russia and the West. The current conflict is also about the transformation of the international system and the strategies employed by the great powers that are on opposing sides of this transformation. As of right now, disagreements shape the structure of the international system. We can say that it's like a disagreement and confrontation between the understanding of maintaining the hegemony of the Western world led by the United States on the one hand, and Russia's demand for the transformation of the international system into a multipolar structure on the other. However, we can say that it's more like a disagreement and a confrontation than anything. A great number of nations that participated in the regions and emerged as regional actors as a result of the conflict in Ukraine are examining the concept of a polycentric world at the moment. On the one hand, nations are at a critical juncture in their development country dealing with significant challenges, including the danger posed by Russia and the shortage of energy resource. Its goal is to establish a more sovereign Europe that works more closely with the nations in its immediate neighborhood. The Czech Republic is the most prominent of these nations. It is one of the V4 countries involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, which began on the 24th of February while proclaiming its support for Ukraine in every conceivable arena. The Czech Republic simultaneously argued at every available opportunity that Russia was responsible for war crimes in. The most severe criticism leveled against Russia since the start of the war originated from at the same time that the Czech Republic was playing a significant role in the escalation of aid to Ukraine. It also provided Ukraine with heavy battle tanks, artillery systems, multiple rocket launcher systems, machine guns, sniper guns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. At the moment, we are able to see armored vehicles and artillery systems in many regions on the Ukrainian. These include heavy battle tanks, armored vehicles, howitzers, and MLRS, all of which were sent to the Ukrainian army by the Czechs. Particularly in the moments when they were on the verge of collapse, the direction of the war was altered as a result of the war. The Czech Republic is exerting all of its efforts to promote and protect the rule of law in. Czech tanks were extensively utilized in the caravan of Kiev, an offensive, and they are currently defending Badmouth and assisting in maintaining order in the Kremeni CVI region of Luhan. The military bases of the Russians and Kady-Ars pro-Russian Chechen troops were destroyed by Czech MLRS now in 2023 in tank and armored vehicle convoys, as we have seen many times before on the Ukrainian. Enter the Ukrainian front over Poland and Romania almost every day with the Czech Republic and look for opportunities to chase and hunt the Russians. Down the military list of the Czech Republic included a large quantity of military hardware such as 89 tanks, 226 armored vehicles, 38 howitzers, and 4 helicopters among other pieces of military. Most importantly, approximately one-third of these arms came directly from the country's existing stockpiles of military equipment. In addition, it delivered over 1.5 million weapons and ammunition, which included 60,000 rockets, 33 rocket launchers, and 4 helicopters. The anti-tank aircraft systems included 4 helicopters even in Ukraine. She constructed a bridge that was 900 meters in. Additionally, the Czech defense industry provided the Ukrainian armed forces with 33 multiple rocket launchers and arranged for the procurement of 500,000 rounds of ammunition for the multiple rocket launcher system MLRS, which included 60,000 missiles. On the other hand, state-owned businesses in Gaza have been granted licenses to export arms to Ukraine for a price as high as $3 billion. According to the report by the National Security Advisor, Tomasz Bor, military equipment with a value of $1.35 billion has already been exported. It is anticipated that within a short period of time, Ukraine will receive shipments of goods valued at approximately $1.8 billion. Regarding the export of arms, some of the supplies were paid for by the countries that were considered to be all. For instance, the United States of America and the Netherlands contributed equally to the cost of repairing the 9072B tanks that have already been transferred by the EU and the US as compensation for the weapons that were sent to Kiev. Friends have been sent to Prague to help moderate the army. In addition to supplying these weapons, the Czech Republic also assisted in the treatment of dozens of injured Ukrainian soldiers, the repair of military equipment, and the training of military personnel. The Czech Ministry of Defense is looking into the possibility of the Czech military police investigating war crimes in Ukraine, as well as the training of junior Ukrainian officers in the Czech Republic. In addition to this, it was found out that the Ministry of Defense was the recipient of the initial compensation from the European Union for military equipment that was delivered to Peter Fiala. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic was one of the leaders of the countries that took the first step toward implementing sanctions that would cut off the financial resources that allowed Moscow to wage this war. Hungary came under fire from the Czech Republic for its stance during the Russia-Ukraine conflict due to the fact that the Czech Republic was one of the first countries to react and show support during the conflict. In fact, Defense Minister Jana Shirnova stated very clearly and loudly her reaction to the news, which was that always been a supporter of V4, but was very upset that Hungarian politicians placed a higher priority on cheap oil from Russia than they did on the lives of Ukrainians. More than 413,000 asylum seekers have been documented as having settled in the Czech Republic, as reported by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. That accounts for approximately 4% of the country's total population, which is 10.7 million people. However, the 1.3 million Ukrainian refugees who have registered in Poland make up only 3.3% of the total population. A survey that was conducted and released in March found that 85% of respondents believed that their government should allow Ukrainian refugees to settle in there. In yet another and more recent survey conducted in July, 75% of respondents indicated that they were in favor of accepting Ukrainians. In a nutshell, we are able to say that the Czech government, along with the Czech people as a whole, have unwaveringly supported Ukraine as a nation in any and all situations. It is still the Ukraine, which is supported by the great war machine and the material power of the West, that is in control of the conflict. However, Europe does not want to participate. Having gained this advantage, the Czech Republic did not think twice before giving Ukraine a substantial amount of financial assistance since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. The Czechs have disclosed that they have contributed approximately $1,665 million worth of military assistance to Ukraine. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, played host to a meeting between the Bucharest Nine and Vice President Joe Biden of the United States. The Bucharest Nine is comprised of Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, and Lithuania, and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. After the meeting, the Czech Prime Minister Peter Fiala stated that since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, he has provided €1,665 million to Ukraine, including weapons and military equipment, and that the Czech Republic is one of the largest suppliers and supporters of Ukraine. He made this statement after stating that the Czech Republic was present at the Chechen Prime Minister Peter Fiala reported for the first time, and in such detail, the amount of military aid provided to Kiev within the scope of cooperation between the state and private companies. He also stated that knowing about this assistance encourages other countries. This way of thinking on the part of the Czech Republic has inspired people in other seas. After such a long period of time, it does not appear likely that Russia will be able to change the situation in Ukraine in its favor. On the other hand, Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, discussed future plans to expand the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces and naval forces. In a statement he mentioned the construction of up to 6 corvettes and the delivery of 2 ready trawlers from Great Great Britain for the. Both of these projects are scheduled to occur. The Turk claims that there are already plans in place for the Auto project and that one of these projects has already begun in terms of preparing for a new attack on the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine stated that they are working on surface kamikaze UAVs, which will be commemorated with a spectacular raid on Russian ships in the temporarily occupied Sable at the end of October 2020. In addition, it was mentioned that most likely the Russians only possess 5-caliber missiles and only 3 submarines that can operate in the dark. It is known that there are 4 submarines of Project 636.8 capable of carrying calibers in the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation. Additionally, there is 1 submarine in Project 877 that is undergoing permanent. Although this is known as the beginning, it is known that there are 4 submarines in Project 636.6 capable of carrying calibers after everything that has taken place. The war that Russia fought in Ukraine last year has taught us a lot about how the ostensibly weak can resist the strong, the dangers of trying to find peace at any cost, and the fact that encouraging arrogant despots is not a viable strategy for victory but possibly the majority of. Most importantly, it taught us the importance of calling our hypotheses about war into question. The Western world has up until this point effectively and proportionately responded to the threats posed by the Kremlin. Over the course of the past year, the Western world has broken its reliance on Russian energy, thereby removing one of Russia's strategic trump card. On the other hand, it is not hard to anticipate that in 2023, Moscow will step up its efforts to fracture the cohesion of Western nations. Many people had the idea that World War I was a year-long conflict that took place in Europe. Now we are rediscovering the wars that may have been responsible for shaping the world as we know it. That could not be. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and that you have notifications turned on so that you are notified when we upload new videos. Our knowledgeable team takes great care in preparing our content for you. This information can only be found on the Ultimate Ukraine channel. On YouTube, we pursue legal action against any and all channels, social media platforms, and websites that make unauthorized use of our content. We appreciate you keeping an eye on. The fighting between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army in the regions where the conflict is taking place has become more intense as the month of March has begun in the conflict that is taking place between Ukraine and Russia. There have been recent developments in the regions of Ukraine that are reminiscent of a donor controversy. The Russian military has stepped up its assaults in the Donetsk territory in recent. They began to consolidate the majority of their forces, in particular within the city of Bakhmut. The most seasoned and highly trained members of the Vietnam group Tobacco City are reportedly being sent from Russia according to the new information that has surfaced. In addition to the Russian soldiers, the Russian army started playing all of its cards in an attempt to seize control of the city. In spite of this, the Ukrainian army is still maintaining its opposition while retreat. Even more significantly, the Ukrainian forces made a significant advance toward regaining command of the situation. In addition, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, General Alexander CKI, issued a statement regarding the matter. CKI reported that he made the decision to station additional troops in this region during his most recent journey. Following the execution of this measure by Ukraine, it would appear that Ukraine is resolved to forestall Russia from acquiring Pakwud Guinea-Prien. The commander of the Vacuum T Troop and mercenary company has also made a statement regarding the current situation in Bakhmut. The Russian military's attempt to take control of the small village is being met with fierce resistance from Ukrainian forces. Backwards, and he obtained a significant number of reservists to fierce conflict, PRN said recently, and a major tank battle between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army, 2 of which occurred in Baller backwards, and he obtained a significant number of reservists to fierce conflict during the time that a tank convoy belonging to the Russian army was advancing toward the Valder region. The Ukrainian army laid an extraordinary trap for the Russian army as it traveled to the Ukrainian army came out of hiding and engaged the Russian army in a tank battle while the Russian army was advancing in columns. The battle took place while the Ukrainian army was engaged. The Ukrainian army, utilizing a defensive strategy known as the shaver, opened fire on a Russian convoy while hiding in various locations. When the Russian escort came closer, the majority of the tanks in the Russian convoy were taken out by the Russian soldiers who were trying to flee. The fighting moved out of the area and away from it. Today, the Ukrainian army was successful in fending off a number of assaults launched by the Russian army, and it also conducted a number of military operations directed against the Russians. A summary of the current situation was distributed by the General Staff of The following assertions were contained within the report. The aggressive operations on the Kayskay Layman Badmouth of Decca and Shakta fronts are currently receiving the majority of the attention and resources that are being allocated by the adversary forces. Over the course of the last day and a half, our armed forces have successfully repelled over 170 assaults along these. There were a total of 16 air attacks carried out by Ukrainian aircraft against Russian military installations and equipment concentrations. A Russian Orlan-10 unmanned aerial vehicle UAV was destroyed by Ukrainian defenders. The artillery and rocket troops of Ukraine attacked Russian T groups, 2 ammunition, storage points, and 3 other critical military targets, while the resistance of the Ukrainian army against the Russian army continues, and a soldier from the Ukrainian army recounts the events he experienced as he served. Andrei, a Ukrainian soldier, described the intense combat they had with the Wagner party. In his account of the events, Andrei reported that the soldiers of the Wagner group were frantically rushing towards. According to Andrea's version of events, the battle did not play out like a scene from Hollywood full of saints. Roughly 10 hours were spent engaged in the fighting. According to the statement made by the Ukrainian soldier, the war had gone on for far too long. They had to switch out dozens of magazines in their machine guns, but it was difficult for them to do so because the AK-47 weapons they were using were getting too. Despite the fact that the Wagner group has transferred the criminals that they gather in prisons to Ukrainian territory, the soldiers have not received any instruction during the conflict. With the less experienced Wagner Group soldiers, PRN employs the soldiers as poles and then sends them to their deaths. A fascinating occurrence took place involving the Ukrainian forces. Soldiers from the vacant group started sprinting towards soldiers from the Ukrainian army. The warriors serving in the Ukrainian army were initially taken aback for a short while. After that, they refocused their attention and they began firing at the soldiers who were fleeing the scene. Even though the soldiers who were running were being shot at, those soldiers continued to advance until they were able to hang on. They went so far as to step on the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers who had been shot and killed by the opposing forces. These sequences felt like something out of a horror movie about zombies. As the Ukrainian soldiers continued to fight valiantly, the Russian soldiers on the opposing side were killed, and then the Russian soldiers on the flank began to attack from 2 separate fronts. The Ukrainian soldiers were taken aback by the sudden attack of Russian soldiers because they were not expecting it during the battle with the first soldiers. The Ukrainian soldiers ran out of them. As a result, the Ukrainian soldiers were forced to make a hasty decision about how to respond to the new assault by the Russian soldiers. A choice was made by the Ukrainian soldiers in a relatively brief amount of time and moved swiftly to the location where the cartridges were stored in order to make a replacement. The Ukrainian soldiers, having replenished their shell supplies, proceeded to fight once again, successfully repelling the Russian soldier. After that, a fascinating occurrence took place. Another 30 warriors, who belonged to the Wagner group, opened fire and then started running erratically. These Ukrainian soldiers were able to be eliminated by the Ukrainian army, which also successfully repelled the assault. The fights went on for a considerable amount of time. Following their victory, Ukrainian troops immediately started to investigate the corpses of their Russian adversaries. As a result of the investigations, it was discovered that the Wagner Group soldiers had suffered bruising to their arms and eyes as a direct consequence of the unfolding events. This led to the conclusion that the Wagner Group managers had provided these warriors with substances similar to drugs prior to the clashes. As a result of the fact that during the fighting, the soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group were rushing towards the Ukrainian soldiers like crazy. According to another Ukrainian soldier named Andrei, the soldiers of the Wagner squad appeared to be running towards them in a zombie-like manner. It was eventually determined what caused the soldiers in the Wagner squad to behave in such a frantic. The leaders of the Wagner Group made a promise to the soldiers that they would be freed after only serving for a total of 6 months. In the field of combat, Russian soldiers were making their way into Ukrainian territory in the hopes of finding liberation there, but the leaders of the Wagner Group were directing them to locations where they would be killed. The soldiers who were sent to battle were required to sign a contract for a period of 6. It was explained to the soldiers that after a period of 6 months of fighting, they would be free to reside wherever they wanted in Russia. The soldiers who were willing to accept the circumstances and were dispatched to Ukraine were treated regularly for 5 months prior to the senior executives sending these soldiers to the regions of Ukraine where fighting is taking place. 1 month before the conflict was scheduled to, Moscow is doing everything it can to win the conflict in Ukraine in spite of the fact that these soldiers are being killed in those territories just 1 month before their freedom. As the first year of the war has come to a close, the Kremlin has not yet obtained any significant victories, but they continue to lie to the population, the soldiers, and the prisoners for their own benefit. The Ukrainian army has been successful in driving the Russian army back in many places since the beginning of the occupation. The Russian force, on the other hand, has been unable to make any headway in the Donetsk region despite concentrating all of their efforts there. It is anticipated that once the arms packages that have been arranged for Ukraine by countries that are members of NATO are delivered to the Ukrainian army, the flow of the conflict will undergo a significant. It is anticipated that once these armaments are in their possession, the Ukraine will begin a new round of offensive operations. In particular, it is said by experts that the operations of the Ukrainian army will intensify even more immediately after the delivery of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. This is expected to take place immediately after the tanks have been delivered this autumn. The Ukrainian military shows no sign of giving up. It is anticipated that this conflict will last for the entirety of all of them. Obtaining territory does not mean that it is free of Russian attackers. On the other hand, Zelensky insists in every statement that they will never be defeated in this conflict. He says this over and over again. The people of Ukraine continue to hold Ukrainian President Zelensky in high esteem and regard him as a heroic. Next intel, the UF battalion, which is widely considered to be the best unit in the Ukraine, delivered a significant blow to the forces of. The UF battalion was responsible for organizing a covert operation that resulted in the elimination of hundreds of Chechen soldiers. A confrontation took place between the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, and Vladimir Putin. As a result of inadequate intelligence provided by Russia, Chechen soldiers were ambushed while operating in. The Russian army, which quickly occupied Ukrainian territory at the start of the war, no longer possesses the strength it once did at the beginning of the conflict. Russian forces were successful in driving the Ukrainian army out of many regions. However, as time goes on, the Russian army continues to suffer losses and is now in a position where it must defend rather than attack. The strength of the Ukrainian armed forces has significantly. The Ukrainian army is currently organizing large-scale operations to retake the territories with support from the countries that are part of the alliance, taken prisoner by the Russian troops that had invaded the country. When Russian President Vladimir Putin noticed that he was beginning to lose control over Ukrainian territory, he solicited assistance from his ally. Putin asked for Ramzan Kadyrov and Alexander Luchento's assistance in providing military support for Ukrainian territory. During their conversation, Kadyrov, who is well known for being a close friend of Putin's, dispatched more than 100,000 Chechen soldiers to Ukraine without batting an eye. After some time had passed, it became clear that this number was in Su, made the announcement of the mobilization in Chechnya behind everyone's backs and is currently attempting to enlist a large number of Chechen citizens in the army. Many people in Chechnya began to demonstrate against the war after Kadyr's declaration of mobilization. However, their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful in preventing Kadyrov's decision. Even though Kadyrov has deployed more than 100,000 troops in Ukraine, Putin believes that this number is still insufficient. Putin had the idea of sending Russian prisoners to fight in Ukraine, and he planned to do so in conjunction with the Afghani mercenary prince who works for the Russian mercenary company. Wagner Prigozhin began making trips to Russian prisons in an effort to enlist new service members for the Russian. Despite the fact that Putin sent Russian prisoners to fight against the Ukrainian army, they said there would be significant consequences. After a while, the convicted soldiers started to cause problems within the army, and eventually they ran away from the front lines. The fact that Russian prisoners were racist and treated Chechen soldiers with whom they came into contact on Ukrainian soil as though they were of a lower social class caused a great deal of. This resulted in a great deal of confusion within the Russian army, and Vladimir Putin took measures to ensure that Chechen and Wagner soldiers were not stationed together in the same headquarters. As a direct consequence of the decision made by Putin, Chechen soldiers stationed at a Russian headquarters in Zizia were given orders to relocate to a different. However, the UF battalion, also known as the Ukrainian Army Special Forces, laid a trap for this military transport and attacked it. According to information obtained by the Ukrainian intelligence service, Chechen soldiers stationed at the military headquarters in Zizia were going to be relocated to another region. In order to determine the origin of the Chechen soldiers, the Ukrainian forces arranged for a reconnaissance flight to be carried out by unmanned fighter jet. It was intended for the Chechen soldiers to be sent to the backward front, which is where the majority of the Russian troops are located. After discovering the path taken by the Chechens, Ukrainian soldiers began following a Chechen convoy using unmanned fighter jets. The Chechens were being pursued by the Ukrainian soldiers ambushing. The Chechen convoy was a mission that was given to the soldiers of the Ukrainian. The most well-known battalion in the Ukrainian army was selected for this mission, and they will be contributing a total of 600 soldiers to the mobilization. It was decided to station the Diazo battalion in the town of Novo Mykolaiv while the Chechen convoy was driving by. Ukrainian Ukrainian soldiers planted a large number of mines and plastic explosives on the. After the Chechen soldiers had passed, the Ukrainian soldiers hid in the woods next to the highway and waited for them to arrive. When a Chechen convoy numbering 300 vehicles arrived at the Nova-Mykolaiv highway, the operation was given the go-ahead to begin. While traveling on the highway, this convoy of 8 vehicles stepped on the mines that had been planted by Ukrainian soldiers, which resulted in a significant. The shock of the explosion caused Chechen soldiers to flee in their vehicles, and as they did so, they began to step on all of the mines that had been planted by UF troops as one by one. The Chechen soldiers exited their vehicles and took up a defensive position, saying something that Chechen soldiers got out of their vehicles as more soldiers came out of their hiding places and took Chechen soldiers who were caught in the cross. The hostile forces that attempted to conceal themselves behind armored vehicles were subjected to intense gunfire and ultimately forced to retreat in order to save their lives. The remaining Chechen soldiers dashed into armored vehicles and fled the area. It is estimated that 202 Chechen soldiers were killed as a direct result of this operate. The ambush laid by the UF battalion caused a significant increase in the level of tension that existed between Kady and Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. Putin was the one who decided to keep Wagner soldiers and Chechen soldiers in separate units. It infuriated Kady that Chechen soldiers were the ones to be removed from the headquarters rather than the banner soldiers. During their meeting in the Kremlin Palace, Putin and Kady exchanged words in the midst of a heated debate. Kady is reported to have said that Chechen soldiers who were fighting in Ukraine were not valued, according to sources close to the Kremlin. Kady criticized the performance of the Russian intelligence service in Ukraine and had very critical words for the head of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerya. According to Kady, the commanders who have been in charge of the Russian army ever since the conflict broke out have not been performing their duties to the best of their abilities. Because of this, he demands that he be given command of all of the troops that are stationed in Ukraine. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin has repeatedly turned down this request. It is said that Putin, who became enraged after hearing these words from Kadyrov, expelled Kady from the citation needed over the past few months. Operations of this kind against Russian forces on Ukrainian soil have become increasingly common. It has been stated by a number of Russian commanders stationed in Ukraine, including Rav Kurin, who formerly served as the commander of the Russian army, surrogates that the intelligence provided by Russia is in Sioux. A significant operation was planned and carried out by the Ukrainian military in Kiev. Prior to the elimination of Surrogate Rubicon, an abandoned hospital in Kiev was taken over by Russian military personnel who converted it into a covert base and stationed 820 troops there. On the other hand, following the Ukrainian, it was discovered by the intelligence service that this hospital was actually a Russian. An aerial operation was begun by the Ukrainian army in this location. This operation, which was carried out with 12 HIR missiles, was responsible for the deaths of over 600 Russian soldiers. Surrogates from Weekend's anger, Survey then went to Vladimir Putin and told him that Russian intelligence was very inadequate and that they were not getting enough efficiency, which was caused by the fact that Russian intelligence failed to see the airstrike organized by the Ukrainian. On the other hand, Putin put the blame for this operation, which was actually carried out by the Ukrainian military and organized by surrogates, on Russian intelligence. As soon as this incident occurred, the Russian general's provision was terminated and Valery Zimov was brought in to take their place. Well, I'm dimmer. Putin does not want to listen to any criticisms being leveled against the Russian armed forces. But even Russian commanders stationed in Ukraine acknowledge that the Russian army suffers from a lack of coordination. The Russian military is said to have an excessive number of recruits and other inexperienced soldiers, and its commanders have complained that this makes it difficult to exercise command. The leader of Russia made the decision to send approximately 300,000 Russian citizens to fight in Ukraine and partially mobilize those citizens. On the other hand, these soldiers had no experience in combat. Pre's operation in Ukraine resulted in the transfer of inexperienced Russian prisoners to that country. Despite the fact that Putin has deployed a large number of troops in Ukraine, we are able to say that each of these soldiers is equivalent to 50,000 soldiers from. Another claim asserts that the reason Vladimir Putin fired Rav Kurin was due to his extreme level of fear of the individual. Recent events have seen Russian General Sergei Slovakian become much more vocal in his criticism of Vladimir Putin. Slovakian, who was the commander of Russian troops stationed inside Ukraine, has total control over the Russian army and has completely subordinated it to them. Slovak rather than Putin were being cited as the source of orders being sought by Russian troops. Vladimir Putin believed that SVI ahead had gained an excessive amount of power and may want to stage a coup in the future. You are aware that Sirovekin has a checkered past. Despite his position as a general, Putin, out of concern that this might occur, averted the potential threat by removing Slovakian from his position before Slovakian could acquire more. And then I started to get in his way. The leader of Russia continues to station Russian troops in Ukraine where they are likely to perish. You can help us out by becoming a subscriber in the east of Ukraine. Russian forces were able to make some incremental territorial gains. Despite this, Russian soldiers have absolutely no optimism about the way the war will ultimately play. The loss of hope within the Russian army has reached such a point that Russian soldiers are openly discussing the fact that they do not even want to continue serving on the front lines. It is not unreasonable to expect civilians to do not want to go to the front, but the fact that even the most powerful troops in the region of Ingrad in Russia do not want to step into the Death Valley in Ukraine means that the Russian army will be wiped. Let's talk about how the Russian army was able to fall apart as a unit. In the following sections, we will investigate in greater depth the reasons why Russian soldiers refuse to go to the front, as well as the repercussions of this event. Heavy fighting is taking place between Ukrainian and Russian forces across a number of front lines in the eastern part of. The government in the Kremlin is prepared to give up a significant number of Russian troops in order to maintain its hold on. Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region prepare a response for any attack that may come from the Russians. In spite of their efforts to gain an advantage through these attacks, the Russian forces were forced to retreat to their defensive positions, suffering significant casualties along the way, despite the fact that the government in the Kremlin does not disclose it. All of the soldiers in the Russian army have had their morale brought down by the news of many casualties coming from the front. It is difficult for Russian soldiers stationed on Ukrainian soil to focus on the war due to the constant stream of news reports detailing casualties. The harsh conditions of the war in Ukraine had an impact, not only on the Russian military personnel stationed there, but also on civilian. At the same time, even the service members who are receiving their training in military academies across a great deal of Russia are profoundly shaken by the reports of the casualties and the difficult conditions. There is a significant risk of unrest breaking out within Russian military training camps. Hopeless and disheartened Russian soldiers can be found occupying every square inch of the territory that makes up the Russian. Riots against the government in the Kremlin were started by Russian soldiers who had lost all hope and were demoralized because of this. Russia requires a significant increase in the number of military personnel in order to maintain its invasion campaigns in eastern Ukraine. Citizens of Russia are secretly conscripted into the armed forces of their country. Under the guise of mobilization, there was a mustering of troops in Kalinin. The outlying regions of Russia have refused to participate in the war on Ukrainian territory, using the term massacre to refer to the events that took place in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk region. The soldiers from Kolin and Grad have no desire to lose their lives in a conflict that was sparked by individual ambitions. By means of a video that was transmitted to Kolin and Grad, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the soldiers who had been mobilized from Kolin and Grad conveyed their demands that they not go to Ukraine. Governor Anton Okarna, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, gave the order for the troops that had been amassed in Kolin and Grad to be moved to the region so that they could participate in offensive operations on the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, which is recognized by. On the other hand, according to the statements made by the Russian soldiers in the video, the training center in Kolin and Grad was responsible for providing the soldiers with instruction and territorial defense. The Russian army will not advance its position by employing these soldiers in offensive operations. After finishing their training on territorial defense, Russian soldiers from Kolin and Grad were mobilized and sent to the Donetsk region in an inconsequential manner to deliver various supply. The pro-Russian separatist troops are now under the command of his subordinate, who has taken over the role of these soldiers on the battlefield, transforming them into storm troops. As a result of the unfortunate occurrences that took place the day before, the mobilized soldiers' outlook became even more pessimistic. A day or two ago, Ukrainian border guards and Russian storm troopers engaged in a fierce and bloody battle with one another. The objective of the Russian armed forces was to penetrate the Ukrainian defensive lines under the direction of Bakhmut. Russian forces established a foothold in a structure in the neighborhood with the intention of breaking through the defensive. The Russian storm unit began its reconnaissance with a drone in an attempt to locate the Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainian forces were able to track down and disable the drone. Following the destruction of the unmanned aerial vehicle, the Ukrainian forces located the building in which the Russian troops were hiding and began to engage in maneuvering. Alongside the mortar fire that was provided by the Ukrainian forces, air support was also provided at the same time. Because of the intense assault, the Russian stormtroopers dispersed themselves throughout the nearby buildings in the conflict between the Ukrainian and Russian forces. The Russian forces had a greater number of soldiers than the Ukrainian. However, after the intense assault by the Ukrainian forces, the numerical advantage that the Russian forces had gained was no longer maintained. As a direct consequence of the attacks launched by the Ukrainians, the Russian forces were forced to withdraw from their current position, during which they sustained significant casualties. As a result of this battle, the Russian stormtroopers suffered a net loss of 9 soldiers and returned to their ranks with a total of 20 wounded. As a result of this event, the soldiers who had been mobilized in Kaliningrad reported in the video to the governor of Kaliningrad that there had been casualties in their battalions and that there had been a breakdown in communication. According to the statements made by the soldiers from Kaliningrad, they were quite literally sent to their deaths on Ukrainian territory. Russian soldiers from Kaliningrad have the misconception that they are artillery. On the other hand, this was not only the case for soldiers from Kaliningrad. Every single member of the Russian army stationed in Ukraine shared this sentiment. Every single Russian soldier who has been mobilized and dispatched to Ukrainian territory shares the same sentiment, and at the training center, they communicate this sentiment to newly mobilized Russian soldier. The number of Russian soldiers who are refusing to be deployed to the Donetsk region in the training centers is growing day by day, which is contributing to the expansion of the revolt. Soldiers from a dispersed unit of the Russian army in the Donetsk region stated that they made it through the conflict despite the extremely challenging circumstances. The soldiers who were not currently associated with any unit have only one desire, and that is to go back to their homes and be with their families in the territory that is controlled by the Russian Federation. Soldiers who were mobilized from the Novice Officer region stated that they were deployed in offensive activities despite receiving defensive training, which was also the case for soldiers who were mobilized from the Kaliningrad. According to reports from troops brought in from the Novice Officer region, the current state of affairs on the battlefield renders further military training superfluous. These kinds of videos are frequently broadcast by the soldiers who were mustered and dispatched to the territory of Ukraine. The pleas of the soldiers who had been mobilized increased, particularly after the beginning of the counterattack that the Ukrainian forces were launched. After hearing these pleadings, the soldiers in the military training camp staged uprisings against the Russian commanders in an effort to prevent themselves from being deployed to Ukraine. Soldiers who had only recently been mobilized either set fire to the training camps or attempted to evacuate the camp as a unit in certain Russian training camps where there was no uprising. The level of endurance of the soldiers significantly decreased. I detailed the soldiers' insurance coverage in my previous paragraph decreased to the point where they were ready to explode like bombs when the spark was lit. It's possible that all of the Russian training camps will experience widespread unrest. The government and the Kremlin will once more rekindle the wick of the uprising in each and every Russian training. The government in the Kremlin has been making efforts for some time now to impose a fresh round of mobilization on the population of Russia. The Russian armed forces are suffering daily casualties from an increasing number of soldiers, and a fresh wave of mobilization is drawing closer with each passing day. However, as a result of this wave of mobilization, it is certain that there will be uprisings that the government in the Kremlin will be unable to. It is not necessary to be a prophet in order to know that Russia will be dragged into a great chaos if we look at the attitude of the Russian people towards the Kremlin and the war after the decision to mobilize following the second wave. As Vice President Joe Biden stated earlier this month, 1 year after the invasion, it is necessary to make a general comment on the course of the war. This comment should be made as soon as he asserted that Putin had already been defeated in the Ukraine election. However, these evaluations are based on the relative strength of the resistance in Ukraine and the blocs that support it. It has been particularly emphasized by NATO and military officials that regardless of the outcome in Ukraine, Russia's invasion has resulted in the fragmentation of the Ukrainian military, which will require years of reorganization in order to recover from the devastating effects of the invasion. This point has been emphasized. However, the most recent assessment that was provided by Pentagon official Colin Cole regarding the investigation that was conducted by the House Armed Services Committee into the accountability of billions of dollars that were transferred from the United States to Ukraine represents a change in these evaluations. Not only has Russia caused irreparable harm to itself, but it has also demonstrated that it is no longer capable of achieving any of the objectives that Putin has set for himself in relation to Ukraine. The new assessment comes at an important time for Ukraine, perhaps the most critical since Russia's initial invasion on February 24th of last year. While the Allies, particularly the United States, are still trying to figure out how to, we are attempting to garner support for the war from the audience they have within their organization. They are also contemplating altering the guidelines for how the game is played. There have been new shipments of arms that could be used to improve Ukraine's chances without further inciting Russia to become involved in the conflict. It appears that Vladimir Putin's goal of invading Ukraine is predicated on the assumption that Western support for the country that was formerly part of the Soviet Union will in due course dwindle and fade, and that by that point he will have sufficient young Russian men at his disposal to send in arms. On the other hand, taking into account the circumstances in which these Russian men find themselves, we can safely say that a great deal of chaos has. Russia is going to be impacted by this chaos. Every period of disorder ushers in a new period of stability. The current government that is controlled by the Kremlin will have no place in the new order. This anarchy will bring with it protests in Russia where there are currently anti-war demonstrations every single day. We appreciate you watching us. The tyranny of Putin has been brought to an end by the people of. It appears that Putin's disastrous leadership will soon bring an end to the war. There is a growing opposition to Putin among the Russian people. The Russian people are Vladimir Putin's greatest source of concern. Nobody can predict what Vladimir Putin will do. In response to these uprisings, the riots and demonstrations are scheduled to take place as part of the overall. According to a study that was carried out by experts and researchers from all over the world, Putin's rule in Russia has resulted in the country's complete and utter collapse. Putin, who has been in power for a significant amount of time, has shown no signs of ending his harsh policies. The populace has reached the point of no return. Putin should step down. Read the banners that were hung up all over. Putin has not changed his behavior and continues to put his own interests ahead of the lives of many people. Putin keeps Russia as his dynasty and uses it to his advantage. We have witnessed this insatiable desire for power at every turn. Throughout history, kingdoms and sultan coexisted in the distant past of our world. In fact, a government structure based on a kingdom is still in use. The term dictatorship is currently used to refer to it in order to ensure their continued existence. Dictatorial leaders like Putin have gradually begun to consolidate their control over all facets of the country. The free press and the judicial system will be the first institutions that these autocrats will seize control of. When a dictator has control of the media and the judiciary, everything else in the country becomes much simpler for him to administer. In the event that there is any risk, he can use the judicial system to frighten away anything that has the potential to cause issues. He is able to mislead his own people who are not directly involved in the affairs of state with lies and false media. It is extremely challenging for opposition states to function effectively inside a nation that is currently ruled by a dictator. Because of this situation, it is impossible for an opposition state to easily resist the dictatorial state. It's possible for dictatorial regimes to last for many years. On the other hand, as was mentioned earlier, dictators' greatest concern is with their own people. If the general public becomes aware of the false media coverage of wrongdoing, dictatorial rule will be in. If you want to skip this preliminary information and get to our main topic, which is the invasion of Ukrainian territory by Russian President Vladimir Putin on February 24th, you can skip. This information is formally recognized as a dictator. With these attitudes, Vladimir Putin, who has served as president of Russia for an extended period of time, appears to have established his own personal kingdom. The actions that Putin took in Russia also help to explain the circumstances surrounding the establishment of his kingdom. People who were just beginning to understand the gravity of the situation almost immediately began staging demonstrations, and after that Russian president, Vladimir Putin banned his people from organizing protests and making anti-war speeches on television, which is his biggest fear. As the dictatorial behavior of the Russian leader continued, he began to take complete control of the Russian media and use it for his own purposes. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Putin has taken control of the media and the judicial system, both of which he has been using for his own interest, up until this point, the general public has started to become aware of the lies and the wrongdoings. As people began to comprehend the gravity of the situation, they initiated demonstrations and declared that they would escalate their efforts in the future. In an effort to bring an end to the uprising in Russia was brought on by Vladimir Putin, who demonstrated his incompetence in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Every operation that Putin undertakes ends in failure, and nobody knows how he does. It has resulted in an increase in the level of anger felt by the people. These reactions can be attributed in large part to the big, In the statements that he made prior to the beginning of the war, Vladimir Putin emphasized that it would only last for 1 week after they entered Ukraine, which is where he declared war. However, the war is now over a year old, and Russia's position is significantly worse than it was at the start of the conflict during the invasion of Ukraine. The Russian army has suffered casualties equivalent to more than 150,000 soldiers. The relatives of these military personnel are trying to make their voices heard. In Russia, people who have lost their own relatives do not want this pain to be experienced by anyone else. This uprising among the people can be seen mirrored in the Russian army as well. Russia is having trouble recruiting enough soldiers to send to the front. The Russian soldiers who were conscripted against their will into the army and sent to the front lines to fight have begun deserting the army one by one. These soldiers were sent there against their will because there is a severe lack of available military personnel. A significant operation that Vladimir Putin is eager to carry out has been repeatedly delayed. It is believed that Vladimir Putin will make an announcement in the spring regarding a massive mobilization in order to carry out this operation. In other words, to form a new army consisting of 500,000 men. When people in Russia and elsewhere around the world heard this news, they went into a frenzy. The deaths of a large number of Russian citizens who were sent to the front after the announcement of partial mobilization during the previous 4 days were a significant factor in why this plan attracted so much attention and reaction. Both the people who were conscripted into the Russian army against their will and the conscripts themselves reacted strongly in order to ensure that something similar does not occur. The people of Russia took to the streets in many different cities across the country and initiated demonstrations stating that they do not want Putin to become president and demanding that the 500,000 soldier operation that Putin had planned be canceled. The people of Russia have made it clear that they do not want anyone's life to be lost for Putin's personal cause. The demonstrations that began in Moscow and St. Petersburg began to give Putin cause for. As we can see here, Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to confront these protests by attacking his own people in order to avoid shaking his own throne. Putin ordered a large number of military personnel to stop the protesters in order to confront them. Putin, who has not given his country any thought at all since the beginning of the war, continues to ignore calls for an end to the soldiers from Russia assaulted their countrymen, leading to the hospitalization and injury of a large number of people from Russia. During these demonstrations, it is common knowledge that over 10,000 protesters were placed under arrest. Putin had the mistaken belief that the protest would end as a result of the repressive measures he took, but this was never the case. Signatures calling on Vladimir Putin to step down have begun to be gathered in a number of different regions around the world, most notably in Russia. The reality in Russia was exposed by the Russian people through the sharing of numerous posts on various social media platforms. Approximately 40 million people living in Russia took part in the signature gathering. More than 2 million Russian citizens took part in the demonstrations that were organized in their country, utilizing the information obtained from the aforementioned petitions and social media sites. This demonstrates that Russian citizens are now organizing against Putin rather than keeping quiet about their opposition. Over 2 million people took to the streets to voice their belief that future demonstrations and riots would be more destructive if Vladimir Putin were to declare another mobilization of any kind. Following the tragic loss of so many lives, individuals in Russia have come together to form organizations of solidarity in the hope of preventing the needless loss of additional lives as a result of an incident that occurred on Ukrainian t. Vladimir Putin, who is dealing with a significant lack of military personnel in the Russian army, has come to the conclusion that he needs to begin the process of mobilization in order to amass sufficient forces for the big spring operation that he is planning. As a result of the various responses to this operation, Vladimir Putin has resorted to using alternative strategies in order to recruit military personnel. After the Russian army suffered losses of soldiers in many parts of Ukraine where it advertised, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has begun placing advertisements on his websites, seeking new recruits to serve in the Russian army on a large number of websites in order to recruit enough people for the military during this time. It also maintains its efforts to recruit military personnel from a variety of locations throughout the middle. The Russian mercenary unit known as the Wagner has also made the decision to pull back from Ukrainian territory. They terminated their agreement with Russia and decided that fleeing the Ukraine was the best course of action on a contract basis. Russia is responsible for providing Ukrainian territory with citizens who have previously received military training. People who want to volunteer must first complete a quick training. The Russian army is experiencing significant difficulties as a result of the Russian occupation. The length of time for which it is unknown. That it will continue in this manner has begun to cause great wounds. Putin, who is completely oblivious to the response of the public and the demonstrations, remains steadfast in his pursuit of his own personal cause.